r/NoSleep. Posted by u/u1alex_merlisai. If you see a snowman in the forest, leave immediately. I live in a small town in Romania. My retired neighbor, let's call him Pavel, used to be a high school history teacher, back in the days. He told me a story about one of his trips in the woods, back in the 80s, before the fall of the communist regime. I've recorded it and told him that we should upload it somewhere. He agreed, as long as I won't give his identity away. So, with the exception of some names that I've changed, I wrote down an exact transcript of his story. My neighbor's story, transcript. Back in 1988, I was living in Brasov. I understand that some people might not be too familiar with our region, so I'll make it clear. It's a small city in southeastern Transylvania, in the Carpathians. It's only a short trip away from the Bran Castle. Many tourists may know it as Dracula's Castle. A beautiful place, with a lot of history. Our teacher told us a lot about it. We were planning to visit it together sometime, but we ended up doing something different. That year, on December 30th, some of my ex-classmates and I went for a 3-day trip in the woods. We were celebrating the 10 years that passed since we graduated high school. We were brought together by Mr. Dima, our history teacher. He didn't have any family, so he was very fond of his students and he always dedicated most of his time to teaching. Plenty of teachers back then were pretty rough, but he was different. He was like a bigger brother to us. He knew how to turn any piece of history into an amazing story. And he'd always know what to say, whenever any of us was troubled. So, we were all very excited to celebrate the new year by throwing a big party somewhere remote, with our favorite mentor. There were 7 of us. Mr. Dima, of course, our big brother, who arranged everything. Then there were Vladimir, Paul, David, Emma, and Diana. Vladimir was the troublemaker that was usually the ringleader behind most of our shenanigans. Ironic to think that he became a prison guard. Paul and David were the 2 brothers and pranksters in our class. We've spent so many weekends at their place, since their dad had a VCR. You know, back in the 80s, plenty of American films were banned or censored, so you had to get your hands on tapes that were smuggled from the West. Not to mention that a VCR back then was so overpriced. It would usually cost as much as a car. Most of us didn't speak English too well, so we used to watch dubbed versions. There was this lady, Irina Margareta Nister, that dubbed a couple thousand movies, all by herself. Look her up, if you don't believe me. It was so goofy. Watching Terminator and hearing her high-pitched voice dubbing Schwarzenegger's lines. But it had a charm of its own, you know. Where were we? Right, Paul and David. And then, there was Emma, the fun and charming girl, you know, the kind of girl that all the boys had a crush on. Well, most of the boys, anyways. She was the competitive one, always getting herself involved in any contest or project that was going on. Although, personally, I was paying more attention to Diana. She was the reserve type, a little bit nerdy, a little bit of a hopeless romantic. She read a lot of novels, and she had Mr. Dima's talent, being a great storyteller. I didn't tell her that I had a thing for her. Well, no point in crying about it now, is it? And, of course, the last one in the party, me. They nicknamed me Mousy, due to a tooth I've lost back in the 10th grade. My obsessive interest in history didn't help either. Most of my colleagues became accountants, factory workers, or, in Vladimir's case, a prison guard. So, during this trip, I was standing out as the new history teacher, the guy that may replace Mr. Dima at some point. Our teacher's brother-in-law was a forest ranger, so he knew about this log cabin, somewhere up in the mountains. The place used to be a gathering point for forest rangers, and lost tourists could also spend the night there. As it turns out, the place had a decent supply of liquor and firewood, so any lost hitchhiker could seek refuge there. The rangers were pretty sure that nobody would turn up in the coming days, so they decided to rent us the cabin, for a decent price. Of course, the whole thing was illegal, and done behind the back of their chief, but it's not like he would ever find out. They were all probably going to get drunk and spend the days at the Rangers' Lodge, far away from the cabin. It was a 4-hour walk through the frozen woods. We've lost half an hour or so going off the road, since it was snowing like crazy, but the trip was sure worth it. We arrived at a 2-story cabin, close to a narrow river. I think it was the one they call Valia Dragovanar. I'm not sure. The place felt very welcoming. It had a nice view of the river and the little grove below. The main room had a long table with 12 seats. The walls were covered with all sorts of decorations and hunting trophies. It felt almost like the home of some Viking warrior. Well, a Viking with finer taste, that is. There were a lot of games lying around, an improvised pool table, and even one of those table football games. It was the first time we were seeing something like it. We didn't even know what it was. I guess we were more interested in all the liquor in the basement. After an hour or so, Mr. Dima sent Vladimir and I outside, to gather some firewood. It looked like it would get very cold in the coming days, so we needed to stock up before we were struck by a snowstorm. As we were walking around the cabin, picking up twigs and branches, Vladimir couldn't keep it to himself and told me, "If I were you, I'd make sure I pick a bed that isn't too squeaky, if you know what I mean." "What are you on about?" I asked, even though I knew what he meant. "I don't know. You seem a little bit too curious about somebody in particular. You're imagining things. You haven't changed a bit. You still have a thing for Diana, don't you? What's it to you? Maybe I can help you out with this, you know? Maybe you can help me out as well." I should have known he was up to something. He wasn't the kind of guy to help you out without getting his reward, one way or another. He continued. "Well, Diana and Emma will probably want to share the same bedroom, you know how those two are. But if you manage to get Diana to spend the night with you, you know, then Emma would need a new roommate." "Diana's engaged, you nitwit," I told him. "So what? It's a one-night thing. Come on. All that time you spent around the prison turned." I stopped, realizing that there was a weird silhouette nearby, watching us from behind the trees. It was hard to see with all the snowfall, but there was something there, all right. Vladimir saw it too. "Who's there?" I asked. No response. We got closer. We were both armed with logs we found lying around. To our relief, we realized that we were spooked by a snowman. It didn't have a carrot, its nose was just another twig, but otherwise, it looked just like any snowman, with a smiley face made out of pieces of coal. It was creepy, I have to admit. It was built pretty close to the pathway on which we came, so we should have noticed it before. We've also noticed that it was wearing a gray hat, similar to the ones worn by the local rangers. We just presumed that Paul and David found the hat inside the cabin and were pulling a prank on us, as they always did back in high school. We returned to the cabin, and, of course, when asked about it, they said that they don't know anything about the snowman. In the evening, we were having dinner together. Mr. Dima brought his old guitar, so we took turns, trying to play something. Of course, Vladimir took the chance to try and impress Emma. Always the charmer. Too bad that he was too drunk to play anything. A couple of hours later, most people were already going to sleep. Diana and I were the only ones left, sitting by the fireplace. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I woke up, all of a sudden. Diana was sleeping next to me. It took me a second to realize that David woke me up. He looked a little worried. I asked him what's wrong. "Hey, so, have you guys seen Paul around?" he asked. "No. I've been sleeping until you woke me up," I answered, angry that he ruined my sleep. "Can we go have a look around? I'm getting worried." Just as David said that, the entrance door creaked open. Paul stepped in. He didn't seem to notice us. Or care about us. He just walked past us, going straight to bed. "David, if this was supposed to be another one of your stupid pranks," I mumbled, still half asleep. "No, wait. I didn't know he was outside," David answered, sounding very defensive. "I've just told him to get lost and to let me get some sleep. But no chance for that. Early in the morning, I get woken up, again, by David. He told me to follow him." We both went to his bedroom. Paul was not around. There was also something very weird on the bed. There was a puddle of water on the left side of the bed, and there were a bunch of twigs lying around, on the bed and on the floor. And then, some small pieces of a black, rocky thing. At first, I thought it was coal, but, after touching it, it felt cold, and a little mushy. It wasn't hard enough to be coal. If this was one of Paul's pranks, I have to admit, it was a pretty good one, because we were creeped out. Still, I was expecting any minute that he'd just jump out from one of the windows and give us a heart attack. A couple of hours later, everybody woke up. After finding out that Paul's not around, and, since it became pretty clear that David was honest, Mr. Dima told us to get ready. We would go out and look for him. Luckily, the cabin had what we needed for a situation like this. We'd split into 2 teams of 3 people. Each of us would get some length of rope and tie it around a steel pole, just outside the cabin. The blizzard was getting pretty strong, and we couldn't risk getting lost in the woods, so, by carrying that rope, we'd easily find our way back. We only had a few hundred meters of rope each, but it had to do. Mr. Dima, Diana and I headed east, just over the river, while David, Vladimir, and Emma went west. We took the hunting rifles in the attic. Vladimir had some experience with guns from his training as a prison guard, and Mr. Dima was in the army, so they knew what they were doing. While we were walking around the woods, Diana and I were trying to come up with all sorts of explanations for what happened. At the end of the day, there was still a chance that Paul was screwing with us, but still, we had to look for him. Maybe he was having a hangover, and decided to have a walk around the area. We've also considered that Paul might be a sleepwalker and went out there while asleep. He did ignore us when he returned last night, after all. While we were searching, we heard something echoing in the distance. It came from the western side of the forest. A deep and constant whistling sound, almost like the sound made by a large plane that passes by. It didn't make sense for a plane to fly around that forest, especially in that kind of weather. There was something off about it. But we didn't give it too much thought. We still had to find Paul. After another hour or so of searching, we headed back to the cabin. The other group didn't return yet. We could see that their rope was still dangling, so they were probably still searching, heading deeper into the forest. The three of us decided to sit by the fire, to warm up for a while, before heading into the forest for another search. Mr. Dima seemed more worried than ever. He was visibly shaken by Paul's disappearance. As we were sharing our thoughts, I brought up the snowman Vladimir and I saw by the river. Mr. Dima didn't seem too interested at first, simply shrugging it off as the creation of some tourist that probably spent the night in the cabin. That was. Until I mentioned the gray hat that it was wearing. He asked me to show him. We went all outside, and headed south, and, after a short walk, we found the snowman, right where we first seen it. Mr. Dima grabbed the gray hat, cleared it of its snow to inspect it, and after a short while, I could see him growing visibly concerned. "This is Radu's hat," he said, his voice shaking anxiously. "Who?" I asked, even though I had a feeling that I'd better not know. "Radu. He was one of the rangers that was on shift these days. This is his hat. Maybe Paul or somebody found it inside the cabin." I tried to reason. "No. Radu was on his shift yesterday. They don't leave their uniforms inside the cabin." As we were there, I felt the need to grab one of the pieces of coal placed on the snowman's face. I had an intuition about something. And sadly, I was right. The pieces of coal placed on this snowman had the same mushy, soft feeling to them, like the ones we found in Paul's bed. I didn't tell the others. I just told them that we should find the other group immediately. As we returned to the cabin, we realized that their rope was no longer stretching, so that meant they must be returning. Nevertheless, we decided to follow the rope. We had to find them as quickly as possible. We were walking at a quick pace. Mr. Dima was leading us, pointing his rifle forward, just in case. We agreed that as soon as we will get back to the cabin, we will pack up and head to the nearest village and call the authorities. While we were heading west, Diana asked us if we've heard about the New Year's assassin. Of course we did. Back then, there was a serial killer that had this nickname, due to his modus operandi. Every year, on the night of December 31st, he killed a child, in the city of Buzau, 3 hours away from Brasov. He started his murder spree in 1985, and every year, on December 31st, he would strike. The snowman. It just made sense to be the artwork of some crazed serial killer. But why would he show up here all of a sudden? As we were discussing this horrifying scenario, Mr. Dima stumbled, almost falling into the snow. He stepped on something, in the snow. We've gathered around, trying to have a better look. After clearing some of the snow, it became clear what it was. A human, lying on the ground. And after we turned it around, we realized. It was Emma. We checked her pulse. She was gone. Her eyes were blank, and devoid of life. And her skin was pale. Pale, almost like the snow. And then, I saw some aspect that horrified me. Looking at her hands. The tips of her fingers. They were rough-looking. And hard to the touch. Almost like the bark of a tree. Diana started yelling, staring forward into the snowstorm. Mr. Dima jumped, his rifle aimed straight forward. There was something dead ahead. Something in the distance, not too far away from us. Mr. Dima shouted, calling Vladimir and David, but he received no response. As we were looking forward, we realized what we were seeing. There, in the distance, were two snowmen. Not even fully taking in what we just saw, almost simultaneously, the three of us started running towards the cabin. We had to get out of there fast. No time to think about it. We wanted to take some supplies and go, But then we decided it would be better to leave everything behind and just run towards the nearest ranger outpost. So, we deviated from the original route and went south, on the pathway, not even stopping for a second when we saw the cabin. We were running so quickly, I turned my head to see if anybody was following us, and bumped into something, and I fell to the ground. I got up immediately. Looking down, I realized that it was the snowman I found yesterday. I've seen those pieces of coal from up close now, and it just clicked. I remembered one of my trips in the woods, when my uncle got his left foot frozen and he eventually had to amputate it. Those weren't pieces of coal. They were lumps of human flesh. Destroyed by frostbite. As we were descending down the mountain, we heard it again. The deep whistling noise. We didn't turn, we just kept going. After some time, I don't know, it felt like ages. We've reached one of those skiing spots. Nobody was around, since the snowstorm forced them to close shop. We didn't have time to equip skiing equipment, so we were looking for some sleighs. We saw a two-person sleigh next to a wooden shed. Mr. Dima told me to grab that sleigh, take Diana and go. He said he'd find another sleigh in the shed or somewhere. Without realizing it, I said I'm sorry. I didn't know why. I suppose. I knew that this might be the last chance I have to talk to him. I got the sleigh in position and told Diana to get behind me. As she did, she had a look back, and she started screaming loudly. I wanted to turn, but she grabbed my head and covered my eyes. I could also hear Mr. Dima screaming, and then, I could feel the earth slipping below me. We were starting to drift downwards. I grabbed Diana's hands and removed them so I could see. As we were plunging through the snow, I heard a loud gunshot. And then, the whistle, again. But this time, it was very loud and sharp. Then came another gunshot. And then, the same whistle. I was drifting the sleigh left and right, trying to dodge the trees in our way, and then, before we knew it, we were launched way up in the air. And then, I only remember everything fading to black. I woke up on January 2nd, in a hospital room, in Brasov. I was told by a medic that Diana and I suffered both head traumas. We were out cold for a couple of days. We told the police what happened, although, I doubt they took us very seriously. In fact, I was worried they might have sent us to the sanatorium if we insisted too much. We were released from the hospital a week later. The police and the rangers combed the forest, but to this day, nobody managed to find our friends. I wish I had an explanation for you. But I don't. I don't understand anything that happened. And I don't have the strength to keep searching for an answer. I can only offer you a piece of advice. If you ever see snowmen in the forest, it would be better to leave, immediately. There would be one more thing. A few months after this terrible incident, Diana told me that the head trauma might have been a blessing in disguise for her. It made her forget some of the things she saw. She showed me a drawing of what she saw in the forest, that day. You can describe it, but I ask you that you never show it to anyone. Please. The drawing. My neighbor handed me a piece of paper, covered in pencil sketches. As requested, I won't post it here, but I will describe it. The figure in the drawing has a humanoid form. An approximate, humanoid form, although it is rather emaciated, slim, and tall. Two arms, that are elongated and thin, are stretching all the way down to the ground. The torso looks bulkier, and, by the look of it, appears to be a mix of snow and tree branches. Overall, the legs and the arms appear somewhat interrupted. As if, pieces of twigs and tree branches are floating around the torso. Or, they are mixed with snow and ice. And on top of the monstrosity, there is a head. It resembles the head of a woman. Except, some of its features appear upside down. The mouth appears to be above the eyeballs, which are two perfect, white circles. And the hair is curly, unkempt, and raised all the way up. And all over its skin, on its arms, legs, torso, and head, the figure appears to be covered in small black circular shapes, like small blobs or moles.